Finally, as we reflect on the anniversary of these events today, dealing with painful memories is natural as our communities continue to heal and rebuild.
NewsWaves 32 reporter Brianna Willis sat down with Dr. Francesca Parker, a graduate psychology professor at Pepperdine, to discuss how to cope with feelings of trauma and grief.
Right now, we're in the week 1 year later from the borderline shooting and, Woolsey fire, and people are starting to feel, somewhat triggered from these events. What would you say to how they're feeling? What advice would you offer to them while they're feeling these thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's really normal to have a reaction on anniversaries. There's even some evidence that people are more likely to injure themselves on the anniversary of a loved one's death, even if they don't remember that it's the anniversary. So trauma and tragedy can get stored really deeply in our bodies and brains, and it's very normal around the same time of year to start to have more intense feelings about it. Use some of your coping strategies, right? So when we're feeling things more intensely, it's a good time to reconnect to friends and family, to use your faith, to use whatever your resources are, but to not think it's strange to be feeling it again a year later, and to really participate in the kind of events that allow us to remember and make meaning out of tragedy and loss.
People who survived Woolsey and people who survived borderline, what would you tell them about maybe feeling some survivor's guilt?
Yeah, so the concept of survivor's guilt is the idea that people who have been through trauma or tragedy and emerged relatively unscathed can sometimes feel guilty about that. So acknowledging that, yes, of course, we wish it was different, but to also be realistic about how much control you did or didn't have in the situation. And it can be a matter of forgiving yourself, recognizing that you did the best you could with what you had at the time. And it can also be just a matter of letting some time pass, and in the meantime, not being too hard on yourself. I'm a big fan of self-compassion.
Young teenagers, young children who had to live through these events as young children and, being evacuated, how would they be feeling right now? What do you suggest for them who have to live through this, live with this for their lives?
Yeah, well, obviously, especially for younger children, something like an evacuation or a natural disaster is especially chaotic, and they have even less control than adults over what's happening. In part, I would suggest that people be guided by how children are reacting, that checking in with children or adolescents about how they're doing is a way to let them know that if they have things they want to discuss, they can come talk to you, whether you're a parent or a sibling or a teacher or nanny. But to also not necessarily push children to feel a certain way, because probably the children who have gone through these events from the last year, some of them may still be feeling effects and may still be struggling, and some of them may be fine. That we know that somewhere around 50 to 60% of people in the U.S. will experience some kind of trauma in their lives, but only about 5 to 10% go on to develop long-term symptoms from it. So children and adults are very resilient, sort of on their own.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that theme and how people can be resilient throughout this process?
So resiliency is sort of defined as our ability to cope with adversity. The idea is that all of us, in everybody's life, there's going to be a certain amount of bumps and adversity and problems. Nobody's life is smooth sailing. So connecting to other people, connecting to things that you're passionate about, and again, that can be family, it can be friends, it can be a faith community, it can be a sports team. That connection to other people increases our resilience, especially if we then are willing to use those supports when we need them. I'm thinking about, there's a concept called post-traumatic growth. And it's the idea that people who experience a trauma, if they're able to work through it and process it and get the support they need, that not only do they bounce back, but there's an idea of that there's a possibility of bouncing forward. That sometimes people who have experienced really extreme adversity will describe things like having a renewed appreciation for life, or having a new purpose, or having their priorities shift so that they realize what's really important to them, and they have more energy and time to focus on what's important to them. It can also be finding a purpose, finding something that you want to rally for, or a cause to raise money for. And so that's one piece of the hope, that when we are able to process and transform our negative experiences, we actually can end up in a place that feels more fulfilling than we would have if we hadn't been through the experience at all.
That's very informative. Now, I've heard about post-traumatic stress, but never about post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, it's really a testament to how resilient people can be, that they can not only recover, but come back stronger through the supportive community.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this show, you know, to remember these people and these places that we lost, but also the growth that we've experienced through it.
Yeah, and all these stories we've heard today are certainly a good way to remember that.
For sure.
Definitely.